Have you ever walked past someone every day without truly seeing them? How many stories go unnoticed in the rush of life? Now, imagine a woman, frail, silent, always sitting on the same bench outside Buckingham Palace. She never speaks, never begs. She just watches. Who is she? Why does she return to the same spot every day? Is she waiting for someone? Is she lost in the past? Or is there something far more heartbreaking behind those quiet, distant eyes? Most people pass her by, never giving her a second thought. But one man, a royal guard trained to stand still, to never break protocol, notices. And when he finally learns her story, it changes everything. But here's the real question. If you saw her, would you have noticed? Or would you have walked past, just like everyone else? Stay with me, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Before we dive into this powerful story, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And if you enjoy thought-provoking tales that stay with you long after they're told, hit that like button and subscribe, because trust me, this is one you won't forget. London in the winter had a particular kind of cold. The kind that slipped past coats and scarves, settling into bones like an unwelcome guest. Tourists still came, despite the biting air, snapping photos of Buckingham Palace as if the grand building itself could ward off the chill. Buses rolled past, their windows fogged with condensation. Street vendors sold roasted chestnuts to shivering visitors, their hands wrapped tightly around steaming paper bags. And yet, amid all the movement, all the noise, all the life pulsing through the city, one figure remained unmoving. An elderly woman sat on the same weathered wooden bench every single day, always at the same hour, always in the same posture. She wasn't like the tourists. She didn't take pictures, didn't smile at the passing guards, didn't even seem to notice the world around her. She simply sat, watching. She wasn't begging, wasn't asking for help. She never even spoke to anyone. Some assumed she was just another old woman passing the time, perhaps reminiscing about her younger days when the palace meant something to her. Most people barely gave her a second glance. But one man did. Corporal Wilbert Turner, a royal guard stationed outside the palace, had noticed her weeks ago. At first, it had just been a passing curiosity. He saw thousands of people every day, but she was different. She wasn't just passing through. She belonged to that bench. For Wilbert, the royal guard uniform wasn't just about standing still and looking unshaken. Observation was everything. He had been trained to notice details others missed. It was part of the job, to read people, to assess their presence, to anticipate movements before they happened. And this woman, something about her was unsettling. She never took a phone call, never read a book, never even checked the time, just stared, day after day, at the massive gates of Buckingham Palace as if waiting for something, or someone, that would never arrive. One day, the air had been colder than usual, the type that turned breaths into mist and numbed fingertips in minutes. Still, she sat there, hands folded neatly on her lap, her frail frame wrapped in a coat that had seen better days. Wilbert had watched longer than usual that afternoon, something gnawing at the back of his mind. Then he saw it. A tourist accidentally dropped a few coins near the woman's feet. He hadn't meant to give her anything, but the coins clattered on the pavement anyway. She didn't move. Not to acknowledge the money. Not to pick it up. She simply sat there. That was the moment it truly sank in for Wilbert. She wasn't there for charity. She wasn't waiting for kindness. She wasn't there for anyone. So why was she there? And why did she look so alone? The next morning, Wilbert got ready for his shift with an unusual feeling in his chest. He stood at his post, watching as Margaret arrived at her usual time. Same bench, same quiet stare at the palace gates. But now, he knew the truth, and it made watching her even harder. He thought about what to do next. Should he tell someone? Should he report what he saw? Would anyone even care? Wilbert exhaled, pushing the thoughts away. It didn't matter. If no one else would care, he would. So during his break, he made a decision. The moment Wilbert stepped out of his uniform and into his civilian jacket, he knew he was crossing a line. Not a legal one, but a personal one. He didn't know why Margaret's presence had stuck with him so much. But today, he couldn't just leave it alone. He had to understand why she came here every day. So, after his shift ended, he grabbed a quick coffee, pulled his scarf tighter against the cold, and waited. Margaret was still sitting there, her frail figure bundled up in a coat that had seen better years. She always left at the same time, just as the last waves of tourists thinned out. Wilbert trailed behind her, keeping a respectful distance. He wasn't trying to invade her privacy. He just wanted to know, where did she go when she left that bench? Margaret's pace was slow, deliberate. Every step looked like an effort. She didn't check her phone, didn't hail a cab, didn't greet anyone. Wilbert had assumed she might take a bus home or head toward a quiet street where she lived. But as they walked further away from Buckingham Palace, his stomach twisted. She wasn't heading toward a home. She was heading somewhere else. After nearly 15 minutes of walking, Margaret took a sharp turn down a quieter street. Wilbert hesitated at the corner before following. That's when he saw it. A homeless shelter. The sign above the door read, St. Vincent's Night Refuge. Margaret stepped inside, her shoulders hunched as if the weight of the world pressed down on them. Wilbert stopped in his tracks. It didn't make sense. This woman, who carried herself with so much quiet dignity, who sat at Buckingham Palace with an air of someone waiting for something important, was homeless? He couldn't move. All this time, he had thought she was someone reminiscing about a past life. But the truth was much harder to accept. She wasn't just visiting the palace every day. She had nowhere else to go. Wilbert lingered nearby, keeping out of sight. Through the shelter's window, he saw Margaret receiving a small tray of food. She took her seat in the corner of the cafeteria, away from the others. Unlike some of the people inside, she didn't eat quickly. Instead, she carefully sipped her soup, broke off small pieces of bread, and tucked half of it into her coat pocket. Wilbert frowned. Was she saving it for later? Or for someone else? He hadn't expected this. He had assumed she was a lonely woman, perhaps reminiscing about her past. But the reality was harsher. She wasn't choosing to be there. She had no other choice. Wilbert walked home with a heaviness in his chest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret at that shelter, carefully saving her bread, eating like she had learned to make food last. How long had she been living like this? Why hadn't anyone helped her? The more he thought about it, the more frustrated he became. She had a connection to the palace. He was sure of it. She didn't sit there out of coincidence. She had a reason, and he needed to know why. That night, Wilbert barely slept. The next day, he made a decision. The morning chill had barely lifted when Wilbert arrived at his post. Sure enough, Margaret was there. Same bench, same distant stare at the palace gates. But today, Wilbert saw her differently. She wasn't just an old woman passing time. She was someone who had been forgotten. And maybe, for the first time, someone was noticing. During his break, Wilbert did something he had never done before. Wilbert sat beside Margaret on the bench, adjusting the cup of tea in his hands. The cold had settled into the air, the kind that made people tuck their chins into their coats and quicken their steps. But Margaret? She never rushed. She stared at the palace gates, the same way she did every day, as if waiting for something that would never come. Wilbert let a moment pass before speaking again. "You come here often," he said, keeping his tone casual. Margaret's hands, resting in her lap, stiffened slightly. "It's a nice place to sit," she replied without looking at him. Her voice was soft, but there was something distant in it, like someone who had long since stopped expecting conversation. Wilbert took a sip of his tea, letting the quiet stretch between them. He didn't want to push. He had spent years as a guard, trained to keep his expressions neutral, to stand still as the world moved around him. But this required a different kind of patience. "I see you here every day," he said eventually. Margaret finally turned to him. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, studied him carefully. She had the look of someone who had spent a lifetime figuring people out. "You're one of the guards, aren't you?" she asked. Wilbert smiled faintly. She had noticed him, too. "Corporal Wilbert Turner," he said, offering his hand. Margaret hesitated before shaking it. Her grip was weaker than it used to be, he could tell, but there was still strength in it. "Margaret Wells," she said simply. Wilbert nodded, rolling the name over in his mind. Now, she wasn't just the woman on the bench. She was someone with a name, a history. For a while, they sat in silence. People came and went, snapping photos of the palace gates, wrapped in their own worlds. Wilbert waited. Finally, Margaret let out a slow breath, one that carried the weight of something long held in. "I worked here once," she said. Wilbert turned to her, caught off guard. "Here?" he asked. Margaret nodded, her gaze still fixed on the palace. She wasn't looking at it as a tourist would. She was looking at it like someone remembering. "A long time ago," she murmured. Wilbert didn't interrupt. "I took care of the horses," she continued, her voice distant. "Back in the days when the stables were my second home." Wilbert felt a small jolt of surprise. "The royal horses? You worked in the royal mews?" he asked, his mind racing. Margaret smiled faintly. A real, genuine smile. It softened her features, made her look younger somehow. "Yes, I knew every horse by name. I could tell you which ones were moody, which ones loved an extra apple or two. I even knew which guards were afraid of them but wouldn't admit it." Wilbert chuckled. He knew exactly the type. "I worked with some of the best trainers," Margaret continued, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. "The kind of people who didn't just handle horses, but understood them." Wilbert could picture it. A younger Margaret, walking confidently through the stables, brushing down one of the royal horses, sharing a quiet moment with an animal that trusted her. "I loved that job," she admitted. Then, just as quickly, the warmth in her voice faded. "But life doesn't always go the way you think it will." Wilbert waited, sensing what was coming next. Margaret's hands curled slightly in her lap. "My husband fell ill," she said, her voice quieter now. Wilbert didn't speak. "We thought it was something small at first. Just a few dizzy spells, some tired days. But then the hospital visits started. The bills started piling up, and before I knew it, the home we built together was gone." Wilbert clenched his jaw. "I left my job at the palace to take care of him full-time," Margaret continued. "By the time he passed, there was nothing left for me." She exhaled, as if the memory itself still took something out of her. "No children, no family, just me." Wilbert looked at her. This woman had once belonged inside those gates. She had been a part of something bigger. And now? She sat outside every day, watching a place she once called home, as if hoping it would remember her. "Did anyone reach out?" Wilbert asked. Margaret shook her head. "I never asked for help," she admitted. "I wasn't raised that way. You take care of yourself. You don't trouble others." Wilbert swallowed hard. She had lost everything, and yet she never begged, never asked for a thing. She just sat, day after day, watching, remembering. For the first time since meeting her, Wilbert felt something tighten in his chest. Margaret had been a part of this world, and yet, when life turned against her, the world had simply moved on. She had been forgotten, but he couldn't forget her now. "You come here every day," Wilbert said after a moment. Margaret nodded. "It's the only place that still feels like home." Her words sat between them, heavy and unshakable. Wilbert didn't know what he was going to do yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her sit there, unseen, any longer. Wilbert couldn't shake Margaret's story from his mind. The thought of her sitting outside a palace where she once worked, unnoticed, forgotten, it didn't sit right with him. That night, he went home and did something he had never done before. Used to sneak apples to the more stubborn ones when no one was looking. Wilbert couldn't help but smile. "What happened to her?" he asked carefully. Arthur's smile faded. "She left when her husband got sick. That was years ago. Never saw her again after that." Wilbert hesitated, unsure how to say what he needed to. "She's still here, Arthur. Well, not here, but outside. She sits on that bench across from the gates every day." Arthur's face fell. "You're joking." "I wish I was," Wilbert muttered. "She doesn't have a home. She never came back after her husband passed. She just sits there, like she's waiting for something." Arthur rubbed his chin, visibly troubled. "That's not right," he said finally. Wilbert nodded. "No, it's not." And he wasn't going to let it stay that way. Wilbert spent the next few days digging deeper. Through some quiet inquiries, he learned that there was a charity program for former palace employees. the Royal Household Staff Benevolent Fund. It provided housing assistance, pensions, and medical care for retired workers who had fallen on hard times. Wilbert thought he had finally found the answer. He contacted the charity, explaining Margaret's situation. There was a pause on the other end. "Margaret Wells, you said?" "Yes. She worked in the Royal Mews, taking care of the horses." The woman on the phone searched through records. Minutes passed. Then, her response came, clipped and firm. "I'm sorry, but there's no record of a Margaret Wells in our database." Wilbert frowned. "That's impossible. She worked there for years. If she was employed under the palace, she would have been registered. But I'm afraid I don't see her name anywhere." Wilbert gritted his teeth. Margaret had been erased from the system. Or worse, she had never been recorded at all. Wilbert found himself pacing his small flat that night, replaying the conversation. Margaret had worked in the palace. So why wasn't she listed anywhere? The answer came to him like a slow realization. She never registered for help. She never asked. Just like she never begged. Never accepted charity. Never wanted to be a burden. Wilbert clenched his fists. She had given everything to her work. She had served loyally, day after day, year after year. And now, she sat outside a place she once belonged to, while the rest of the world moved on without her. The next day, Wilbert tried again. He went back to the charity's office, this time in person. "Listen," he said, keeping his voice steady. Asterisk, she worked there. I have someone who remembers her. She has no home, no family. Isn't that exactly what this fund is for?" The woman at the desk sighed. "I understand, but without records," Wilbert leaned in. Wilbert tightened his grip around the cup in his hands. "No, it's not." Margaret turned, her sharp eyes locking onto his. For the first time, she saw something in him, something she hadn't seen in a long time, someone willing to fight for her. And whether she believed it or not, Wilbert wasn't done yet. Margaret had spent years believing that no one saw her anymore. People walked past her every day. Tourists, locals, workers heading home after long shifts, but she had become part of the background, a forgotten figure in a world that moved too fast. But not today. That morning, as she arrived at her usual bench outside Buckingham Palace, something felt different. The wind was sharp, the sky heavy with the promise of rain, but something caught her eye immediately. A small folded note was placed neatly on her seat. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the crisp paper. The words were handwritten, simple, thoughtful. "For someone who once gave so much, you deserve warmth. Look under the bench." Margaret's breath hitched. For a moment, she just sat there, staring at the note in disbelief. Then, slowly, she leaned down. And there it was. A warm winter coat, neatly folded, waiting for her. Margaret stared at the coat. It wasn't new, but it was clean, thick, and sturdy. The kind that could keep someone safe against the bitter London cold. Her fingers brushed against the fabric, and a lump formed in her throat. She looked around instinctively, searching for the person responsible. Had someone seen her struggling against the cold? Had someone actually noticed her? For a long moment, she just sat there, coat in her lap, the note still trembling in her fingers. It had been so long since anyone had done something like this for her. From his usual post, Wilbert watched carefully. He saw the way Margaret stared at the coat, as if she couldn't quite believe it was meant for her. She glanced around, scanning the crowd, searching for the face of her silent benefactor. But Wilbert didn't move. He didn't want her to know. Not yet. He wasn't doing this for recognition. He was doing this because someone had to. And today, that someone was him. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the bench again, wrapped in her new coat. Wilbert couldn't help but notice the way she held herself. A little straighter, a little warmer. The cold still cut through the air, but for the first time, she wasn't shivering. Then she saw it. Another note, placed neatly where she always sat. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. "A cup of tea is waiting for you, inside the cafe across the street. No payment needed." Margaret inhaled sharply, her eyes flickering to the small cafe opposite the palace. She hesitated. Was this real? Or was this some kind of cruel joke? But as she sat there, Torn between curiosity and caution, the cold wind pushed through the streets again. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself hope. Margaret entered the cafe slowly, hesitant, unsure. The warmth inside was immediate, wrapping around her like a forgotten memory. A young barista spotted her instantly, offering a small smile. "Tea for Margaret, right?" Margaret froze. Someone had left it for her by name. Her fingers gripped the note in her pocket. She swallowed hard before nodding. "Yes, tea for Margaret." The barista didn't ask questions. She just handed over a steaming cup, wrapped in a sleeve to keep it warm. Margaret took it carefully, feeling the heat seep into her fingers. It was just a cup of tea, and yet it felt like so much more. Her eyes burned. She blinked fast, trying to push the feeling away. She hadn't cried in public in years. She wasn't about to start now, but as she stepped outside, tea in hand, she found herself smiling. A small, hesitant smile, the first one in weeks. Wilbert saw the moment it happened, the moment Margaret smiled. She didn't know who was behind it. She didn't know that he had set it all in motion, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He wasn't finished. This was just the beginning. Margaret wasn't just some woman sitting on a bench anymore. She was someone who had given years of her life to this place, someone who had been forgotten. And now, someone was finally remembering. Wilbert had never considered himself an emotional man. His job required discipline, composure, and unwavering focus. It was a duty built on tradition, a role where emotion was a weakness, where the uniform demanded more from a person than just standing still. It required strength of mind. But what was happening now? This wasn't duty. This was justice. And Wilbert wasn't stopping until Margaret Wells was finally remembered. After weeks of digging, of facing dead ends and bureaucratic walls, Wilbert finally found his breakthrough. Through a network of former palace staff, he tracked down George Lyle, an ex-palace official who had worked at Buckingham Palace for decades. If anyone remembered Margaret, it would be him. Wilbert arranged a quiet meeting at a small cafe, not far from the palace. George was in his late 70s, his posture slightly hunched, but his mind still sharp. As soon as Wilbert mentioned Margaret Wells, George's expression changed. "Margaret?" he repeated, setting down his cup of tea. "You're telling me she's still here?" Wilbert nodded. "She never left." George exhaled, rubbing his chin. "Good Lord. She was one of the finest workers we had in the Royal Mews. Always knew when a horse needed something before the trainers did. She loved that place more than anything." Wilbert leaned forward. "I need proof. Official proof that she worked there. The Palace Staff Fund won't help without records." George frowned. She should have been listed. But back then, things weren't always recorded properly, especially for caretakers. The system was different. Wilbert fought his frustration. Bureaucracy had erased her name, and now she was paying the price. "I don't need a system to tell me she worked there," George continued. "I was there. I remember." Wilbert knew that wasn't enough. He needed documentation, a formal trail. Then George snapped his fingers. "Wait, the old handwritten logs. The Royal Mews kept them for years, even after the records went digital." Wilbert felt a rush of hope. "Do you think they still exist?" George smiled. "If they do, I know exactly where to look." It took 2 more days before Wilbert got a call. "Found it," George said simply. Wilbert rushed to meet him. Sitting on the table was an old, faded ledger, the pages yellowed with time. George flipped through the pages with careful hands before stopping. And there it was, Margaret Wells. Her name, written in ink, alongside the years she worked. Her role, her duties, her service. Wilbert exhaled sharply. This was it. This was the one thing that proved she had belonged inside those palace gates. And now, she was going back. One evening, as Margaret sat at her usual bench, a man in a formal coat approached. He wasn't just another tourist or passerby. He was from the palace. Margaret stiffened. "Mrs. Wells?" the man asked gently. She nodded, confused. "I'm here on behalf of the royal household. We've been made aware of your past service at Buckingham Palace, and after verifying your records, we'd like to formally invite you back." Margaret froze. "Invite me back?" she echoed. The man smiled. You are eligible for a place to stay in the former staff residence. More importantly, the royal family wishes to acknowledge your years of service. A private ceremony has been arranged in your honor." Margaret gripped the edge of the bench. She had dreamed of this place remembering her, but she had never expected this. "Why now?" she whispered, voice trembling. The man's expression softened. "Because someone fought for you." Margaret blinked. "Who?" The man hesitated, then simply smiled. "You'll see." The day of the private ceremony, Margaret stood outside the palace gates. Only this time, she wasn't looking in from the outside. She was being welcomed in. As the gates opened for her, she felt the years melt away. The halls she had once walked were just as she remembered. She could almost hear the sounds of the horses, the echoes of voices calling out instructions, the soft murmur of past conversations. And then, the moment she never imagined. Inside one of the palace chambers, a small gathering had been arranged. Not an extravagant event, but something deeply personal. A formal acknowledgement of her service. A simple but meaningful honor. Her name was spoken aloud. Her work was remembered. Her place in the palace's history was restored. And when she was presented with a small medal of recognition, Margaret's hands shook. She hadn't been forgotten. Not entirely. And for the first time in decades, she felt like she belonged again. As Margaret stepped back outside, feeling lighter than she had in years, she turned to the line of palace guards standing in their ceremonial positions. For a moment, her eyes met Wilbert's. And in that instant, she knew. She didn't need anyone to tell her. She didn't need to ask. He was the one who had fought for her. She nodded once, a small but powerful gesture. Wilbert, standing rigid in his formation, didn't break protocol, but his eyes said everything. She understood. And for the first time in years, she walked away with her head held high. Margaret sat by the window of her new home, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. The place wasn't grand, not a palace or even a large flat, but it was hers. A modest, comfortable space in the former staff residence, where she finally had warmth, a bed, and a door she could close at night. She had lived through so much, survived so much, and now, she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. It had been a month since the palace ceremony. A month since she had stepped back inside the walls of her old life and seen her name restored in the records where it belonged. Margaret wasn't sure why, but today, she felt the need to walk the streets of London again, to visit one last time. She didn't take the usual slow steps of someone dragging their past behind them. Today, she walked with purpose, not as a woman stuck in time, but as someone who had finally been seen. When Margaret arrived at Buckingham Palace, it wasn't to sit on the bench. She didn't take her usual place, staring longingly at the gates, hoping for something she could never reach. She walked right up to them. The grand gates stood tall in front of her, the very same she had looked at for years, separated by nothing but metal bars and memory. And yet, today, they felt different. Not a barrier, not a reminder of what she had lost, but a symbol of what had been given back to her. She wasn't outside looking in anymore. She was a part of it again. Her hands rested on the gate, fingers tracing the cool metal, and for a moment, she simply stood there, remembering, feeling whole again. Margaret was about to turn and leave when she noticed movement from the corner of her eye. The guards on duty, Wilbert included, shifted in their formation. Then, in one synchronized movement, they turned their heads ever so slightly in her direction. It was almost imperceptible, a fraction of a motion, not enough to break protocol, but enough that she knew. A silent tribute, a quiet acknowledgement, a farewell that spoke louder than words ever could. Margaret fought the lump in her throat. She gave them a small, grateful nod. And in that moment, she knew she would never be forgotten again.